the star of the show, Raj Date, who's going to be telling us all about how regulators can and should use AI. And I will say off the bat, I mean, we've already obviously heard from Comptroller Gould, and so I think we've set a good foundation both for the regulatory viewpoint as well as obviously how this technology works and how institutions are using it. So, Raj, I want to start with something before we get into the details of this topic. Just broadly speaking, how would you suggest that the heads of regulatory agencies even think about the intersection of AI with their various supervisory missions?
Yeah, great. I will answer that. But first, I'll thank Peter and thank John and the rest of the Spring Labs team for the invitation to be here. John had called me like a year and a half ago before the first installment of this particular conference, and I couldn't make it, but I also thought, nobody's going to go to that. And then everyone went to it, and so who is the schmuck then? So it's good to be able to remediate that now. So I think the most important thing for agency heads with respect to this topic in particular is to first understand just kind of the terrain and the situation that they're in. So first, you have to do something. If you had had the good judgment to run an agency 15 years ago, I had that good judgment, or even 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, I bet, you could have safely done nothing at all. And under the assumption that surely I will be retired before any of this matters. And that is no longer available to you. So you actually do, in fact, have to do something. The second thing I think to be aware of, and actually the comptroller said as much this morning, you are not in this job forever. You're not in this job forever. And indeed, apparently, there aren't even really independent regulatory agencies anymore. So I think I would bet you over time that the tenure of agency heads starts to converge on the median tenure of assistant secretaries in the big executive branch departments. And that's 20 months. So you don't have much time. And you cannot count on the idea that your successor is necessarily going to be of similar mind or even of goodwill towards the project of the agency. And so if you take all that together, I think it means that you have to have a portfolio of initiatives on anything that matters. And by portfolio of initiatives, I mean in this context, over time. Stuff that can get done in a year, stuff that can get done in 5, and stuff that you're going to put the foundation down for things that will be important in a decade or more. I think that's the way to think about that portfolio. And then on an axis separate from that, so you got things over time, you also have to think about both of the functions that you are meant to be leading. And Jonathan actually also talked about this through a different lens this morning, which is you are, of course, the mission of all these agencies is to try to make sure that the financial markets or financial institutions function well and promote kind of economic vibrancy in a sound way. But in addition, you are meant to be leading and building an institution that is meant to endure over time and hopefully be great at what it does. And sometimes those two things overlap, but often they don't, and you shouldn't lose sight of either.
Yeah, I mean, again, he mentioned it this morning, the OCC is 162 years old, right? It was founded during the Civil War. So obviously a lot of things in the industry have changed, but the goal, the kind of fundamental mission of a safe and sound banking system persists and is something that lasts over time. I think in financial services, one of the things that's interesting is, as it comes to AI, in some senses, we're actually a little ahead of the game, right? Because we have established frameworks for things like model risk management that are pretty well vetted at this point and that are well understood. So I think in some senses, that framework and those systems that we've already built, I suppose you could argue adapt well to this new environment we're headed into, but at the same time, and we heard this morning from multiple folks on different panels, this technology, and I think it's important at the AI Native Conference to be as specific as we can when we use the term AI, generative AI and large language models work fundamentally differently than other kind of AI technologies that model risk frameworks were built for. So what's your sense of how the existing kind of regulatory infrastructure that we have fits with this new technology and where some of the gaps might be?
Yeah, I mean, in at least a couple of ways, we have a leg up in financial services because even though it's a different set of technologies that we are focused on mostly here today, the fact is that like machine learning approaches within financial services are rather considerably more deployed and in use today than in lots of other industries. So it has been well more than a decade that at scale kind of use in credit decisioning or in fraud detection, like all that is very real. And as a consequence, you have a bunch of constituents, including regulators, for whom the concept, broadly speaking, is not jarring. That said, you're absolutely right. Like all of the regulatory frameworks that you otherwise would associate with the adoption of machine learning algorithms and, say, credit decisioning are not quite a great fit with respect to LLMs and their application.
And the comptroller said as much this morning, right?
Yeah, and listen, I'm torn because he had a line which I'm sure like is people can get enthusiastic about. He said something like, you know, if we decide that that generative AI models are models within the meaning of model risk management, you know, we're all screwed. And
I wrote that down in my notebook.
yes, and you know, maybe therefore the right thing to do is to adopt a parallel, distinct regime that would cover these tools.
Yeah.
I kind of feel though that would be a little bit of a miss, because even with respect to machine learning approaches and just in general banking, I would argue that you know our approach to model risk management and our approach to third-party risk management and our approach to a lot of different things within the supervisory realm are just way too process-oriented, way too prescriptive, have cycle times that are way too long, and the entire exercise is way too manual. Yeah. And that really matters. It has some really bad long-term effects on the industry, and I wouldn't. There's something in me that says, well, let's just create a new thing for this set of stuff instead of like let's just fix what we have already, and then we can figure out whether or not there's tweaks.
No, that makes sense. I mean, the idea, I think the hardest thing from a regulatory policy perspective is harmonizing something new with something that exists, right? But to your point, that might be the most durable approach to take. And another thing that the comptroller mentioned this morning that I wanted to get your take on, you referenced it before, but you helped stand up the CFPB originally. And so you had a window into exactly how this kind of world operates. We're talking about how regulators can and should use AI, and I want to break that apart. And let's start with can. I didn't get the sense from the comptroller that the OCC was going to be using large language models anytime soon. And for anyone in the room who's I've been on either side of the bank procurement process, like imagine that, but about 1,000 times worse. And that's roughly the process you have to go through if you're a regulator trying to update technology, buy technology, get access to it. So when we're talking about regulators, how they can and should use AI, on the can front, where do you see kind of the biggest gaps or challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that are uniquely bad about trying to get things done within government agencies. Yeah. So to the extent that the entire enterprise basically runs on the procurement of technology and people, like there are like real constraints to the speed with which, the efficiency with which you can actually make decisions and onboard both technology platforms and people. There are reasons for that, right? So the Republic is about to be 250 years old. Over the course of that 2.5 centuries, there have been abuses of discretion. Look at the newspaper any given day. Like, and therefore, you know, perhaps predictably, every time there has been an abuse of discretion, the reaction by the legislature has been to reduce discretion. And as a consequence, it's a giant pain in the neck to get things done, but it's not impossible. I'll step outside of technology and talk about people for a second.
Sure,
like it's a giant pain in the neck to hire people, but it can be done, right? I joined the CFPB when we had 13 people. By the time we left, we had 1,300. It can be done in the same way that it is possible to, you know, performance manage people within the government setting. Yeah. It's just that people don't like to do it is the issue. And so it would take it is daunting, but absolutely kind of can be done. But look, there are other problems too, right? Like, so for example, there's inherent risk asymmetry with respect to regulatory agencies. Like if you're a line examiner at the FDIC and one of your regulated charges fails, I can guarantee you people know about it. But if, you know, any given year they don't fail, nobody's throwing you a parade. And as a consequence, there's a real risk-reward asymmetry that leads to a thoroughgoing conservatism and like, man, like this might work out okay, but what does that get me? That's how human beings are.
Yeah.
And it's very much true at the regulatory agencies, so much so that it ends up that sort of conservatism and, oh my gosh, do we really have to deal with this kind of knee-jerk reaction, bleeds through to the regulated charges themselves at the banks. Like anyone who's spent much time in a bank anytime during the course of my career has noted a certain tendency towards sclerosis that, I mean, there's a reason when you have a forward-leaning bank, some of which are in this room, it's a reason we find that so remarkable.
Right, they stand out.
Yeah, which is sad and alarming, and something that we ought to take seriously as being a symptom of some underlying things that I think that we can fix.
So just kind of building off of your comment there, one thing I'd like to ask you about is how you think the current AI moment might shift that dynamic a bit. Because what you described about the risk versus reward, I mean, that's the fundamental challenge, right? That, you know, no one is going to throw me a parade if a bank doesn't fail. If I do something that can be tied to a bank failing, I get in a lot of trouble. So there's just a natural consequence. I wonder if just the pace at which all of this is happening, the pace at which AI is moving, and financial services and fintech more broadly, do you think that's shifting that risk-reward calculus at all for regulators?
Maybe, but I think the main thing that it does is it enables a couple of operational changes. It might enable some operational changes that heretofore would have been very difficult for any given leader to pull off. So, for example, one of the problems with a mostly manual kind of in seriatim sort of a supervisory approach is that by the time you get final supervisory results back, they are relating to activities that happened 18 to 24 months ago.
Right.
And because informal findings are shared typically along the way, and bank management teams wisely try to address those things as they are raised, final exam reports have a decidedly anachronistic feel to them by the time they're finally delivered. And it's what drives a lot of regulators crazy is that the bank management teams and bank boards sort of react by saying, well, this isn't even a problem anymore. Why are we even talking about it? But I understand why that's the reaction. So I believe that using, not immediately out of the gates, but at least trying to take some relatively low-risk institutions and take some extremely aggressive goals. So how is it that we can reduce the cycle time between a first-day letter and the final exam report by 75% and do it for 75% less money?
Yeah.
If you don't aim for that, you are only going to get trifling incremental improvements. And there's no point in trifling incremental improvements if you actually are taking on meaningful near-term risk. Because I can guarantee you, the first dozen times you try to do this, you're going to miss stuff. Things are going to go wrong. But look, the CFPB has supervisory jurisdiction over the top, whatever. What is it now? Maybe 100 plus banks, you know, over 10 billion in assets. Now, half of those banks are just not very high risk from a consumer point of view, like at all.
Right.
And so maybe we should take an effort to try to deploy new approaches, knowing full well that we're going to have to iterate over time. But if you know that you have to iterate over time to get to something that works, you better start soon.
Yeah. Yeah. So digging in on that front then, on the should front, how should regulators be using AI? I want to ask you about a couple different areas. One is, you mentioned it before, people, right? I would say, speaking charitably, that most of the regulatory agencies, your old agency in particular, are engaged in a protracted effort to see how much they can do without from a people and a resource perspective. That obviously poses a lot of challenges, and I think those challenges are going to be magnified, and Comptroller Gould talked about it this morning. You know, the regulatory perimeter is expanding, it's changing, it's evolving. There are stablecoin issuers that are coming into the space. There's fintech companies getting charters. The work for regulators is expanding, it's not contracting. Can AI help regulators become more efficient at supervision, at rulemaking, at research? Like, where do you see, just from a people standpoint, a potential lift?
We better find something that helps. Because rewind even before this massive reduction in kind of headcount at the agencies, particularly the CFPB, but it's a government-wide thing.
It is, yeah.
Even before that, if you walked around and just went to meetings, you know, at some of the bank regulatory agencies, like just the demographics didn't look like a normal human population, right? Like it looked very bimodal. You had a bunch of guys who sort of looked like me with gray hair and kind of exude sort of a I'm on my last lap kind of vibe. And then like
You do give that vibe,
thank
Raj.
you,
Yeah.
thank you. And then a bunch of sort of kids running around giving off a distinct I don't know what I'm doing vibe, and not enough people, like professional services organizations should have people in their 30s and 40s, and it was this bimodal distribution that works until the former group retire.
Yeah.
And then you have some real problems because in some of these fields, like pattern recognition really matters.
Totally.
Right? Someone who's been a bank examiner for 15 years is not just linearly better than somebody who's been at it for 15 months.
Yeah.
Like there's a massive difference in effectiveness and just kind of wisdom associated with that pattern recognition. And one thing that gives me hope in this domain is that one thing that these models seem to be really good at is pattern recognition.
Yep.
And so if there is a way to be able to create a senior examiner type judgment out of a relatively junior person, I think that would be great.
Yep.
There are nearer term, I think, opportunities as well. So for example, like the day one document delivery associated with most exams is so stupefyingly voluminous. Like I just don't believe people are reading it.
Yeah, right.
I don't believe it. I say the same thing about like bank board books that will have like 500-600 pages. They're not reading it. It's like this collective, like ludicrous kind of farce that we're all
Like we all agree to
living in.
pretend we're reading the
Yeah,
homework,
yeah.
but we're not actually reading the
This
homework.
is why, by the way, I never really liked like Diligent and the other kind of electronic delivery of things because I know there is some record of what you've read and what you haven't. So word for the securities bar, I guess, out there. Like, ask for that in Discovery. I have no idea how I started on this rant, but
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I was thinking about a different context for this, which is we had the session earlier about open banking, right? And one of the things that struck me about a lot of the debates that have been happening about open banking recently is there were a lot of times when banks or fintech companies or data aggregators would get asked a question in the rulemaking process, and the answer was, well, we were sort of hoping the CFPB would do that. Right? Like, who's going to vet out all of these fintech companies that are connecting to banks through aggregators? How do we know they're safe? How do we know they're not, committing fraud against the customers that they claim to be working for? Well, there is no way, and that's a third-party risk management vetting challenge that someone has to take on. And it was like no one wanted to touch that, right? And really, it was just a lot of work. And the work, I think, is something that, if it's not done entirely by AI, could at least be automated by or made much more efficient by. So it sounds like that's kind of how you're thinking as well.
Yeah, and look, it's not like some kind of panacea. So for example, think about how much, like take an example. So right now, across this land, there are dozens of people who are working on like updates to their third-party risk management reports on the creditworthiness of, pick your favorite, Fiserv.
Yep.
Is that really a good use of time for like all of these different institutions to be doing every single quarter? Is that like is that sensible at all?
Totally.
Probably, probably not.
Yeah.
So there is something sort of tempting to say, well, we have all these crazy things that we do. Let's just have the machine do the crazy things.
Yep.
I would prefer if we just fix the crazy things first, but at least this gives us a cheap shortcut.
Yeah, we're not going to do that, Raj, so we might as well make it more efficient. The other thing you mentioned, these models being uniquely good at certain things. One thing we know these models are uniquely good at is parsing unstructured data. And that one is interesting to me because, as you just illustrated, financial services regulation is rife with documentation. It is rife with unstructured, loosely structured, badly structured data. And I remember hearing pitches in the past from people going, yeah, we can apply machine learning and automation, and we can make regulation and regulatory supervision that much more efficient. And I was like, have you seen the data in this space? Like, it's not good. It's not really like set up for that. However, again, these large language models don't trip over that to the same extent. I'll use your former employers as the example. The consumer complaint database has millions, tens of millions of consumer complaints that are all written narratives about what happened. I know the CFPB does as much work as it can to like categorize and respond and manage those, but there's probably a lot of nuance hiding in that data that no one sees or understands. what do you think about the potential for large language models to help in parsing the unstructured data that sort of regulators swim through every day?
Yeah, it's not just regulators. I mean, you're right about sort of the state of data quality. And in fact, for a period of decades, a great way to get paid for 3 years was to promise the delivery of a structured, cleaned up data warehouse, and the key was to get out and move to the next place before it was discovered that this doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of unstructured data. The other driver, by the way, is that, the number, how many banks do we have in the country today? 5,000-ish?
Yeah.
When I started my career, it was probably closer to 20,000.
Yeah.
So monotonic decline, and almost all of which through M&A. And the dirty little secret is it's way more fun and easy to buy a bank than it is to merge back-end platforms, right? So you end up with all kinds of stranded data assets over time.
Yeah.
And the ability of these models to be not quite as brittle is a big advantage. And that's even before you get to things like, kind of plain text narratives of things, which are completely unworkable otherwise.
Yeah.
I would even be on this subject of like what can be gleaned from complaint data.
Yeah.
Like I would even be, I guess, more ambitious, which is, it might be nice for the CFPB to do, but you remember, like, regulatory complaints are sort of the very tip of the iceberg. Because you've got line level kind of inquiries, complaints, and then escalation units, and you typically have like an executive response. I mean, the reason why I think I have a U.S. senator is to call him when something has gone wrong, and I can guarantee you, people pay attention.
Yeah.
And only then do people, like normal people, don't say, "Oh, something went wrong. I'm going to call the office of the comptroller of the currency."
Right.
Like that's weird. And so you're only seeing a tiny, tiny subsection.
Yeah.
Whereas, if this is a doable thing, then it almost definitionally is doable at scale.
Yep.
And so why don't we just look at every single complaint that comes in with respect to the credit card business to the frontline staffs across the industry?
Totally.
Because surely there ought to be something that can be learned that is uniquely applicable, uniquely useful to regulators, not just line management.
No, that makes sense, and it kind of touches on another area I wanted to ask you about quickly, which is
don't forget what you're going to say. But if you could start using approaches like that, it would take the pressure off of, for example, like the industry went bananas with respect to the 1071 rulemaking.
Yeah, they didn't like that.
Bananas.
Yeah.
And like, I've seen HMDA data, right? And so an entire new reporting regime that is sort of based on the HMDA reporting regime, I could see the objections, but the main reason why people object is it's a giant pain in the neck.
I was going to say, it's a lot of work.
Because the source data is kind of messed up.
Yeah.
And like, oh my God, and is this even going to be used? And so I think that to be able to replace some of these reporting regimes that are pretty error prone, the way we do them, and super expensive, with using technology to be able to get a good enough kind of picture, I think would be a big step forward.
No, that makes sense. And I think that the other element that probably will change a bit is just the way in which consumers, regulators, financial institutions all sort of interact with each other right now. And using consumer complaints as the example, it's a pretty strange process to submit a complaint, hope to hear back, maybe be referred to an institution to work through a problem. Like, it's very lengthy, it's time consuming, it's messy, it's not fun. How do you think about the rise of like these agents that are going to be acting on behalf of different entities, whether it's consumers, financial institutions, or even regulators? Like, is all of this just going to get legislated between all of our agents in the future? How do you think about that part of it?
Yeah, possibly. I do think that it is one of the things that we need a no-kidding policy answer to. Because the problem is the financial incentives are not identical between your agent and mine, say. I'll give you an example. I think that the people who understand sort of the Reg E dispute process the best in the world are crime rings. Right, because they have a financial incentive to understand it better than anybody else.
Right.
And my worry is that we get that on steroids if we get to the world that you're talking about. So I think we are going to have some kind of conduct standards around that interaction.
Well, and I guess the other aspect to that that's interesting to me is, and I've written about this, but in a lot of cases, the theoretical use case of these technologies actually puts bank like business models under a lot of strain, right? And like one of the things that I don't know that we always associate with the term safety and soundness is like these prudential regulators want banks to make money and be profitable and to survive. How do you think about like just, and it doesn't have to be just AI, but like as technology changes, the competitive dynamics in the industry, as it puts things like net interest margin under more pressure, like how does that impact just safety and soundness in the way regulators approach these technologies?
I find it impossible to believe that we won't see an acceleration in the monotonic decline in the number of banks.
Yeah.
Like, I would like to be like everyone else, pretend that everything's going to be great for small banks and blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. No way. And that's even before we get to some of the more profound, longer-term issues. So, for example, the reason why a small business, pound for pound, is like financially a more attractive customer than like a middle market commercial customer is that a middle market firm has a treasurer and a small business doesn't. Yeah. So they're not paying someone to maniacally, kind of optimize every penny all over the world. Like that's
there's
just
gonna be like, hey, we like our community bank. We're gonna keep all our money there.
Yeah, and like, what's the big deal? It's like $2,000 a year I'm giving up. Who cares?
Yeah.
As it turns out, at scale, that really matters.
Yeah.
And so if you had a robot running around basically acting like a large corporate treasurer for every small business in the country, or every high net worth family, watch out. Because you think you don't have a firm grasp on deposit betas today. And by the way, you don't. Like, I think that was a lesson of March 2023. Is
For
it?
sure.
Any Wachovia veterans here? No? Let's talk about them. So
it was a bank a long time ago.
During the crisis, a lot of us who were observers of deposit behavior were astonished to see small business deposits fleeing Wachovia during the teeth of the crisis. Because everyone kind of assumed that would never happen. Like what? It happened.
Yeah.
And that is a problem. Like it would generate a ton of consumer surplus.
Totally.
It's very good for kind of high balance consumers and small businesses if this were to happen. But the banking system, as you understand it, will not work like that. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we're just going to migrate to a land where it's all private credit, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe. That works 8 out of every 10 years.
The crypto people tell us
that other 2 years. That's the problem.
No. Well, just pressing on that a little bit more, I mean, how do regulators adapt to that, right? Because like using deposit betas as an example, they have models for how they understand the world to work. And when the world changes, those models tend to get updated only after something breaks. It feels likely to me that the pace at which those models break and reform themselves is going to happen faster and faster, and maybe not even always be accompanied by an acute crisis that causes us to sort of look in the mirror. How do you think about that sort of evolving risk profile that's a little harder to aim at than the traditional pace of, yes, we know every 10 years there'll be a financial crisis and then we'll update our playbooks? Like, that doesn't seem like the world we're headed into.
No, I think this is much worse. Worse from the point of view of, if you're nostalgic about the commercial banking system and how it has functioned with static kind of liquidity ratios and static kind of capital ratios. Like I think it is, it could be a different world. Yeah. It's one that will develop because there's real money driving the change. Yeah. It's worth quite a bit actually to reduce, kind of economic rent seeking in small business deposits. It's a gigantic amount of money, so people are going to pursue it. And the difficulty is that I just don't know how you would model what that world looks like until you're in it.
Yep.
And so the natural policymaker kind of reaction to that is, well, we already have belts and suspenders, let's get more suspenders. And the industry will go the aforementioned bananas when that happens.
Right.
Like, it's always very difficult to be counter-cyclical. Like, everything seems great right now. Everything seems great. It's very hard to be the person saying, you know what, not only could there be trouble that we don't see yet today, but things could get a lot worse, so we have to prepare now.
Right.
Really hard to do.
People don't want to sign up for that.
No.
So wrapping up, I did want to ask you about like long tail risks, right? Because I think the other thing, kind of building off of the point you just made, is that there's sort of the part of the industry you see, and there's the part of the industry that you don't see. And I think with AI, it's a really clear distinction between those two things, because the part of the industry that you see as it relates to generative AI are banks and like at-scale fintech companies that, for the most part, when you ask them how they're using generative AI, they talk in pretty like general terms about, well, we're using it for the back office, we're using it to automate certain tasks, we always have a human in the loop. Like it's this very like measured, conservative answer that I think makes regulators feel good and is somewhat designed to make regulators feel comfortable with that. However, we know that for every one of those institutions, there's 10 startups that are young, new, kind of going to your point, maybe with people who haven't been around and seen some of this stuff before, and are naturally going to be less careful. And they're going to use AI, they are using AI right now in ways that I think if regulators understood what was happening, they would like blanch at. So how do regulators get a sense of that sort of hidden part of the market and what risks might be lingering in there? Because to me with AI, that's one of the places that we're going to have to watch for is what's the stuff that the banks aren't doing, but the competitors that are trying to take share away from them are using this technology for?
Yeah, well, in a way, we are lucky that it's financial services, and so people are very attentive to like every penny.
Yep.
Like, it's people's money. It actually does matter, and like the error bars around things have to be super, super narrow.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are things like, so for example, you're able to generate on-the-fly digital marketing, hyper-customized to people over time. And your ability as a regulator to be able to have a sense of whether or not those made by a machine for either human or machine consumption marketing materials, like how are you going to know whether or not they're okay?
Is it a UDAP violation if you trick the consumer's agent into thinking something?
You know what? It's funny to think about, but we are going to have answers to questions like that.
Yeah.
For sure. The biggest, I think, the most significant kind of fat tail kind of problem is the one that we were just talking about, is that asset liability, there is a world in which, in my lifetime, in which asset liability management and the way that we have conducted it during my entire career is just simply no longer the way that you can think about it. Yeah. It's a very different world. Just because the microphone hasn't been cut off yet, I'll also mention another kind of risk that has not as much to do with financial services. Chris Murphy, who is the junior senator from Connecticut, and not a wacko, gave a speech yesterday, I think, at Brookings, and this is the kind of thing I read. And you should take a look at it. Some of the kernels in there are sort of his point of view that part of what makes our kids grow emotionally and makes us all human is sort of trial and error and discovering things on your own. And to the extent that we are like rushing headlong into a world in which you don't kind of need to do a lot of that stuff, you might not like where you head. And so in terms of like the most profound kind of risks is like, are we kind of tinkering with what makes us people? But you will figure that out, Alex. I have no doubt.
We'll make sure that we leave the industry in good hands for you, Raj. Please join me in thanking Raj Date.